Okay, so welcome to our third discussion of Plato's Symposium. By chance, I thought we would have a look at the people in the dialogue, and that will also help because we have a couple of people who are visiting. So I'm going to share online the image by the Auerbach, a 19th century German painter of the Symposium, which most of you won't have here. So you can just maybe have a look at that. I'm just going to open this so I can get access to the desktop. No, there's no more than. Right. Okay. So online you should be seeing this painting. And I've sent round a handout, which I'll open up in a minute for people online, but you have here, which has some details about the people in the dialogue. But first, why are we reading a Platonic dialogue? Well, what we discussed at the beginning. Why Plato writes dialogues, and I've got a paragraph from. You okay with?
Yeah, so they can fit
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's okay. So there's a quote on this handout that I sent around from Aristotle in the Poetics, where he's discussing all art as a form of imitation, and this is not very well understood by modern people because our notion of an imitative painter is someone who paints realistically, and that's precisely what he doesn't mean. He means you produce a paradigm which shows the key or essence or the being of a thing, and that's not going to be a reproduction. So, for example, people in accord with our modern understanding of representation or reproduction thought that photographs would replace painting, but they can't because it's designed by a human being who can intensify and select certain aspects of the phenomena they're depicting. They can paint a more true picture of a human portrait than any photograph ever could. And that's what Aristotle means. You don't have to be convinced by that. I'm just reproducing this teaching. So I'll read this paragraph from Aristotle. He says, "It's manifest from what has been said," which we don't have, so we just have to pretend, "that it is the work of the poet not to state the things that happened, but the sorts of things which could have happened and which are possible in likelihood or necessity. Because the writer of history and the poet don't differ by speaking in verse or otherwise, because if you put the works of Herodotus in metre, they will be no less a history with metre or without metre. But rather they differ in this, by stating what did happen on the one hand and what could have happened on the other. That's why poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history." So poems, Aeschylus's Agamemnon gets closer to the truth than a history of kingship, for example. Because poetry speaks of what is more universal, and history of individual things. Universal things are what sort of things a certain sort of person happens to say or do in likelihood or necessity, which the poet aims at, attaching names to it. So they make a figure to represent a certain, let's say, aspect of human nature, but it's individual, so you can call it Hamlet, Lear, Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and it has all of the appurtenances of an individual breathing being, but it represents a certain kind of character that would be likely or necessary to act in a certain way in a certain set of circumstances. And that makes it a work of art from which anyone could learn, in principle, from any society, from a different linguistic, ethnic background or whatever. So that's why poetry is more philosophical than history, which just records what does happen. Yeah. Whereas history records the individual things such as what Alcibiades did or suffered, by coincidence referring to one of the people in this dialogue. So Plato is not an historian. So Plato is understood to be in the general 20th, 21st century scholarly literature as two things: a an historian who records what certain historical people did, sometimes at the right time, sometimes he doesn't care about the dates. So he's an historian and he's a bit of a poet. You know, there are these rhetorical flourishes, and he invents an ancient regime that never existed in Atlantis, that was actually ancient Athens, and also a logician who subjects certain statements to logical scrutiny according to the contemporary predicate calculus. And he's those three separate things. And so the people in the English department, they'll handle the literary flourishes, and the people in the philosophy department will handle the logical sections, and so on. That means you'll never ever approach Plato, who wrote these things as wholes in order to speak differently to different people. And the first line of an essay that I recently read on Plato's Republic began with by saying, if the aim of scholarship is reaching a consensus, then we have not succeeded in interpreting these four lines in the Republic. The aim of Plato is the absolute contrary of reaching consensus. He teaches in the dialogues that he speaks differently to different people by not saying anything himself. Plato is completely silent. One of his main characters is a Socrates, a philosopher, who he appears to hold forth as the paradigm of a philosopher, and that person says why they will never write, and they won't write because writings say the same things to everyone. Plato's intention, by implication, and there are many, many textual evidences for this, writes in order to say different things to different people, to make them better than they are. And that means that the dialogue, if we want to understand it, to reach whatever level we can grasp from it, it'll be by trying to understand it as a dramatic whole in which certain aspects of human nature become visible if we're attentive to the parts and the whole, and not pull out some passages for logical deconstruction and others for examine their rhetorical structure. Okay, and Aristotle has a very. I found that paragraph. I think it's helpful for understanding what Plato was doing, which is not history. Now, it happens that many things exactly seem to be exactly as he discusses them. So the inner dialogue of of the Symposium is set in 416 BC, and that appears to be from an historian, that was when Agathon won his first prize, and these people are having this drinking party the second night after the celebration. And that appears to have actually happened, and these people appear to have been alive at that time. But obviously, this is not the conversation they had. There was no dictaphone. There's no way of knowing what they talked about. But what is the essence that Plato was trying to get at? Well, at 415 BC, or 415, 416, just after the time in which Agathon won the first prize with his tragedy, a number of crimes were committed one night by some drunken people, and some of the people involved in this dialogue were involved, and that brings me to this handout. I'll just quickly run through the people in this painting, and then we go to the handout and the involvement or otherwise of the people and their ages and so on, because we're starting to build a picture of who they are, having been through that first speech. But if you look at this painting, so Albach has put together people. He's trying to suggest something by the proximity of people to who they are. So just starting from the left, Alcibiades comes in, and that's what happens very late in this dialogue. He comes in after they've decided to praise the god Eros. He comes in and forces them all to drink, and he gives a speech in praise of Socrates. So we end up with 7 speeches of praise, 6 for the god Eros and 1 for Socrates. So there's Alcibiades supported by his friends. Then, so we have Agathon, who's at this time, so Alcibiades about this time is mid-30s. Yeah, he was one of the youngest generals voted. Athenians voted in their generals. One of the youngest generals the Athenians had, and he's one of the people implied in these crimes. Agathon's also mid-30s, and to his right, half obscured by his arm, is presumably the older, late middle-aged gentleman who is his lover. So Alcibiades is famous for having many love affairs. In this dialogue, Plato deliberately has him uh, turn the tables on the normal relationship where an older man pursues a younger man, and he depicts that in that there's a dialogue called the Alcibiades one, in which Socrates approaches Alcibiades and Alcibiades, and he says, I suppose you're fairly proud of yourself that you have acted so, uh, proud, hubristically towards all of these people who approach you as lovers, and you've spurned them and sent them away defeated. And I suppose you wonder why I'm approaching you now. And then they begin this conversation. So it looks like Socrates is one of these older lovers. But then at the end of the dialogue, Alcibiades says, I will attend on you and try and learn from you. And in this dialogue, the Symposium, we see Alcibiades try to seduce Socrates. It's hilarious. We'll come to that later. So whether or not Alcibiades is a lover or a beloved is questionable. So that's Agathon and Pausanias. They make a couple, and then the next couple is there's a young man behind Agathon, and that's presumably Phaedrus, who is next to an older man, Eryximachus, identifiable by the medical symbol on the lamp. Then next is Socrates, and he is facing Aristophanes, and I take that to be because the main person that Socrates picks up in his speech to argue with implicitly is Aristophanes. And then, hard to say. We've got a couple of unidentified people. Normally, in a banquet room, you'd have 7 couches, and I've put the couch numbers on the side of this table on the handout, which I'll open the handout now. Figure out how to do this. Okay. So this table contains all the people in the symposium and in the frame of the dialogue. So we start with Apollodorus, who is talking to unnamed companions, and he relates what he said yesterday to someone called Glaucon and other unnamed people, business people.
Martin, can you enlarge it, please?
How's that?
That's better.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, so next we meet Socrates. Once we get into the symposium, Socrates is invited by Agathon to sit next to him, and Socrates says something that Agathon finds outrageous, and Agathon says, we will have a contest in wisdom to be judged in court by Dionysus. And Alcibiades comes in at the end with a wreath suggesting that he is Dionysus. In any case, I'm just going to pick up the fact that of the people who are participating in this symposium, several are going to be put to death for impiety. Now, the act, to put it into Aristotle's terms, we have certain kinds of people, philosopher, poet, tragic poet, comic poet, doctor, and so on. And we have what they would do, it is likely or necessary that they will do or say. Now, this is the only discussion in which the subject is a god, an Athenian god, right? Well, it's not an Athenian god, it's a god of the poets, Eros, as opposed to, say, Aphrodite, which is part of the Athenian cult. But it's the only discussion in which a god is discussed, and Socrates points out, well, argues, that it's not a god. So it appears as if, and this will be important for the speech we discuss shortly, that Socrates, the philosopher, doesn't believe in the gods. And he is tried and executed for impiety in 399 BC, so 16, 17 years after the dialogue. So then we have Agathon, who we've discussed, Alcibiades, who was also accused of profaning the mystery. So these two crimes, desecrating the statues of Hermes, which were on all of the intersections of the roads, and profaning the mysteries, which is apparently what Alcibiades and some other people did. And by 415 BC, he had been put in joint charge on the expedition to take Syracuse in Sicily, and his trial was delayed, so he left with the fleet, and then he was condemned in absentia, and then he fled and went to Sparta and helped the Spartans win a few victories against Athens. So then Eryximachus, who's the doctor, who's the lover of Phaedrus, and he was charged with desecrating the Herms. I thought that he was executed, but I can't now confirm that. So Aristodemus, who is this lover of Socrates, who relates the whole story, who goes to this banquet, and who doesn't report anything that he said if he gave a speech. Aristophanes, who's a comic poet at this time, about 34, and who had recently written a play showing Socrates to be an atheist physicist and teacher of rhetoric. So then Apollodorus, who's reporting this whole dialogue. I think that's everyone. Pausanias, which is the speech we're discussing tonight, he's the older lover of Agathon, and then Phaedrus, who is the beloved of Eryximachus. He was accused of profaning the mysteries, and he also fled into exile. He came back some years before Socrates died too, now living in poverty. Now, I know I must have copied and pasted the wrong thing. That's incorrect. He's he's the blue. No, he has no profession, so he's he's at this point in time he's rich enough to just read and talk and go to parties. So he's he's living the life of the college student for about 15 years. Then, of course, he did something impious and had to leave town. Now, there's a dialogue called the Protagoras, in which all of the people who speak in the Symposium are present, except for Aristophanes. And the reason for that is that it's a meeting of sophists, such as Protagoras, Hippias, and Prodicus, Protagoras is well known to have made millions by teaching people rhetoric and so on. And the dialogue called the Protagoras is Socrates' encounter with sophistry. And I just translated one of the opening pages, and I'll leave it for you to have a look at if you feel like it. But just to show the associations of some of the people in our dialogue. So in the paragraph, so this is on the second side of this handout. In the second paragraph, after having wandered in, seen Protagoras with these groups of people walking on either side of him, and as he turns around, they execute a perfect circle and walk back on either side as he discourses in the portico, as if he's Aristotle. And then Socrates makes a couple of quotes from Homer as he described who else is there. And the quotes come from the book in the Odyssey where Odysseus goes into the underworld. So he's describing the meeting with the sophists at Callias's house as going into the underworld. And he cites Homer to do that. In the Symposium, he cites Homer, that phrase about when two go on together, one can see what is best to do first. And that's when there are two Achaean Greek spies going into Troy. And so then he's indicating he's going into the house of poetry as into the enemy field, undercover. And he's undercover because he's actually washed and he's wearing shoes. And so he's going to fit in with the beautiful, famous Agathon. Whereas here, he's going into the underworld of sophistry. But most of the same people are there. So there's a sophist called Hippias, with whom Eryximachus and Phaedrus, so they're a couple and picked out as a couple. And there's another sophist called Prodicus, and with him, amongst the people with him, is Pausanias, and with Pausanias, a young man, still a youth, noble or beautiful. So this word noble or beautiful is the same Greek word, and we're going to have to put up with that a lot because it's a central word in the Symposium, because the usual object of eros is beauty or nobility. So a young, noble and good in his nature, as I suppose, and quite beautiful in looks, in his idea, and that's Agathon. He learns that person is Agathon. So that's the 15 or 16 or 18-year-old Agathon. And Agathon at 30 is still the boyfriend of this man Pausanias. Okay, that's enough of that. Any questions about any of this background? Someone invent a question while I try and find the actual dialogue. Right.
I had one about because last week we were talking about the lover and the beloved, and I found it quite difficult because we were I couldn't stop importing a modern view of love and relationships into it. So so these guys, when you say they're a couple, like it's a gay couple as we would call it today, but one of them is a beloved and one of them is a lover. Is that right? Like I couldn't quite so I'm distracted by my awful hair, but I couldn't quite get when they were talking about loved and the beloved.
Yeah.
Beloved. It's a sense of dominance from one to the other, or just a sense of if you're superior socially, you can kind of take what you want from someone who is inferior socially, or
that's something that that's a very helpful question. But so that's what everyone criticizes, that someone takes advantage of someone. But you're right to pick up that it is meant to be incongruous, right? It's not two people with a straightforward mutual attraction.
Yeah,
that's that. And that now, why this is a practice, obviously this is a practice in Athens and Sparta and other places. So why does Plato write about that? Because he sees something in it. He has all kinds of criticisms which are implied in the speeches that promote it. So Pausanias is the one who most strongly promotes this kind of relationship, as we'll see when we read some of the speech. Phaedrus has implicitly endorsed it already because he is young and beautiful, and he says, the first thing he says after saying, Eros is the greatest god because of he's the oldest, and because he's the oldest, he's the causes of the greatest goods. His next sentence is, the greatest good for a young man is a useful lover, right? So he's the beloved, and it's useful for him to have an older lover.
Yes, and I was saying this to my husband, who is older than me and quite useful, and that's why, and I do find that quite attractive. So that's why I was giving that speech 8 out of 10, because I agree. Okay. But I resent it when it's the other way around, when he finds me useful as a secretary or as a, like just general Gen Y person. Yes, but I agree with that premise. That a useful lover is very useful in life.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, our notion of the mutual love has something of this, which I mentioned last time, devolves from Rousseau, that we have to, since there is no, in the modern notion of a legal community is based upon a social contract, there is no genuine common good apart from not being harmed. So you have no real reason to be attached to other people, to not lie to other people, etc., etc. And Rousseau tries to refound that whole understanding by putting the romantic, what we now call the romantic relationship, at the core of it. But he, similar to the lines that you suggest, has people who have complementary natures, not the same nature. Whereas we have now, for political reasons, decided that it should be equal, not just equal, but the same.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when things become very political, it's very hard to argue about them without people becoming angry.
Mm.
So it becomes an object of indignation. Right? Now that's interesting in itself. That's interesting because Phaedrus makes this insane proposal that a city or an army should be based on lovers. Right? Make a private passion should be the motivating force for a whole community. And he says that will work perfectly. They'll be unbeatable because everyone will be ashamed of doing the wrong thing in front of their beloved. Not quite so much the other way around. But that's meant to be a mad proposal, right? But we've done that. Like we have made private emotions the mainspring of public political life. But that means immediately you have to police them. And now we are policing emotions. You must be able to identify your emotions as falling upon under one of these categories, and those ones aren't allowed. And we're going to ban certain emotions. I'm afraid hate is banned. So that's extremely interesting. And I'll immediately change tack back to the symposium. But yeah, so there's this now.
Can I, Martin,
Yeah,
Peter here, can I just clarify that discussion you just had? I want to read out an excerpt from a paper, and I'm wondering if you would agree with it. It's talking about the relation, the homosexual relation between a lover and beloved. And it sees it as, in the Symposium, an asymmetrical relation through which the beloved is supposedly meant to become virtuous, whilst the lover obtains sexual gratification. Is that too simplistic an understanding?
that's kind of yes. I mean, because what that is an interpretation of Pausanias' speech, which takes part of what he is saying as if what he's saying is true, and then on the other hand, looks underneath to what Pausanias is actually implying without saying it, and puts those two things together. So what I want to do is start from the surface, look at Pausanias' proposal as it is, and then try and understand what it means against his own intention, and not put those two together separately.
Okay, so what I've read out is too simplistic.
It just doesn't take us in order. We will misunderstand things. It's a completely understandable thing to say, right? So what we have is this relationship, which now Plato expends a lot of time on this unequal relationship, and it's not because I've seen essays that say the following: Plato and Socrates were or were not extremely attracted to this relationship, and that's why they talk about it. That's mad. It's like saying Shakespeare wrote about King Lear because he wanted to be the king of England. It's just people on Shakespeare and Plato's level aren't morons. They choose and select from the whole of their learning, which is very considerable. Those things they think, as Aristotle said, can show you what is universal in a particular, which means a paradigm. And that in this paradigm of a relationship, they see all kinds of problems, and those problems are implied in Pausanias' speech, which when we'll go to, we'll see there's inner contradictions, And it ends up with exactly actually that statement that Peter read out to us. That's one of the results, because that makes no sense. There's a relationship between two people in which the younger person becomes excellent and philosophical by sexually tending to the older person, just because they're a model of decency and good character. It doesn't make any sense, right? And I don't think Pausanias' speech makes sense in the end. So why does Plato reproduce it? Because he is saying that, well, we have this discussion of eros, or the basic longing and the strongest longing that all human beings have to some degree, and so on. And it can actualize itself in various ways, as we've just discussed 3 or 4. Now, in all of them, there must be in all of them a reflection of the highest human desire from Plato's point of view. And so he tries to show in what those things are that are high in all of them, whilst allowing us to see what is bad or criminal in them. And just to give one example, in the first speech, so Phaedrus says, Phaedrus is implicitly endorsing this relationship because he is a very beautiful young person who has all kinds of useful lovers. And that's one of the things he says, by the way, that the lover is always careful not to do something that would shame them before the beloved, because they love, all their eros is directed towards one person. When he turns to the beloved, he says, but the beloved doesn't want to do something shameful before their lovers, because if one lover is useful, 5 lovers is even more useful. So there's no, but in that discussion, there's this asymmetry between him and each of the speeches. In each person, unconsciously or consciously, in Socrates' case, puts forward their way of life as the highest. And so Phaedrus puts himself forward at its best to be beautiful and attractive. But there is something that comes back from that comes back in Socrates' speech, which attempts to combine all of these aspects of eros, which is that what is truly worthy of admiration and longing is itself higher than the person who longs for them. And to put that in extremely simplistic terms, Socrates doesn't consider himself higher than the beings or forms that he contemplates. That comes back in. And in Pausanias' speech, there's also something that these people, like Pausanias, take themselves to be doing something higher than merely making children. And there's something of that in the Platonic eros. It's not generative, it's contemplative. Whereas in modern philosophy, the whole point of philosophy is to make. You get the extreme hysterical version of that in Marx. The point of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And it doesn't make any sense from the Platonic point of view, because if you're going to change it without first understanding the principles by which a change will be better or worse, you will just lead to chaos and madness. Okay. Yeah, was there any other thoughts or questions for what we've read last week? Or if not, we'll go to the Pausanias' text. I did want to say, one more general thing, and I'll just put this on the board, so I was going to pin myself. Okay, so we have started with Phaedrus, and he defined as the object the greatest good as utility. Now, we started the whole dialogue itself with a condemnation of utility. Apollo is berating these sensible businessmen who want to be able to pay off their mortgage and saying, I have now made it a business to follow Socrates around and learn everything he says and does. So there is something which is above utility. And this is our first, for every human being and in every society that hasn't gone through the 25 revolutions that we've been through, there is something that's noble. That's the high, not good. not useful, that's low, and calculated. It's necessary. You have to calculate how many ships you'll need to ward off the Persians or whatever. But that's different from fighting in those ships nobly in order to defend Athens, etc. So the noble comes to sight as being not calculated and therefore not being the good, but what is high. Now, this dialogue is in part an argument about that, because in Socrates' speech, the good comes in as the highest, and what is noble or beautiful is the appearance of the good. The good or the beautiful is not the noble or the beautiful is not in itself the highest. It's how it appears in which one tries to generate and so on. But this is the normal characteristic starting point for a human being looking at human activities and products and words. Now, let's just discuss this briefly last time, but it would be helpful. So there are different ways of understanding this continuum. The one way from chapter 15 of Machiavelli's Prince is to say everything high can be reduced to the low. So this is that's really this is a push, and we reduce the high to the low. That gives us the most comprehensive understanding. Everyone understands that you don't want to buy, that you would like to have money, but it's best to have two things, not one, and so on. Right? So the high, these beautiful paintings and poems and institutions, they're sublimations or fantasies that we in order to get what's real. And you get the same thing from Machiavelli through Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, because the whole point of Kant's philosophy is to make what he considers noble, which is morality. And that morality will enable everyone to have an equal right. And so on. Nietzsche, everything is reducible to the will to power. Freud, all of the works of art, like when he discusses paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, it's just, as usual, it's the longing for sex and power. So this is the one Marx, usable to the media production. That's the modern view, is that this is very simplistic. Obviously, you need several bodies to argue back and forth. There are 27 exceptions and so on. But in general, the modern is for the sake of greater understanding. Because if we can do that, now we can have a science of the human psyche, because we know what it really wants. Whereas for the classics, it's the other way around. The most real, is the high, is beauty, justice, and so on. Those are the most real things, and an act of injustice is a very poor reflection of that being. I'm putting this very simply, but okay. So that said, we'll go to Pausanias.
Can I just quickly ask a question whilst you're doing that?
Yep.
When you put the rail there on the screen, it prompted me to think about Lacan's idea of the rail, which is not the same as the modern idea of the rail. When you talk about the modern, you've talked about Freud being one of the moderns.
Yep.
Do you see Lacan also as being a modern in that regard?
I don't read Lacan.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, can't comment. Okay, so we are at, where is this? Page 10 of this translation, which some of you have, at 180C. So Apollodorus says that Aristodemus said that Phaedrus made some such speech, and after Phaedrus there were some others that he scarcely could recall, he passed him over and told of Pausanias' speech. So we'll read the beginning couple of paragraphs and discuss this. And yeah, we need to read the end, but we'll get as far as we can at the beginning. So Pausanias said, Phaedrus, in my opinion, it is not noble the way the argument has been proposed to us, commanding us to eulogize Eros in so unqualified a fashion. For were Eros one, it would be noble, but as it is, Eros is not, the proposal is not noble, for he is not one, Eros is not one, and as he is not one, it is more correct that it be declared beforehand which Eros is to be praised. And the key word there is correct. So if you do something correctly, you are doing something in accord with some kind of standard. Pausanias' speech is an attempt to find a standard by which his favored relations, this older man, him, and this younger man, Agathon, by which that is the best kind of Eros, by which it is justified, he is justified in being that lover, and Agathon is justified in gratifying him. That's the purpose of this speech, to find a standard by which that's correct. Right. So he says, so first I shall try to set the record straight. And that's another word that means in the Greek has the same word correct in it. I am going to set this upright. And then the word orthos, like orthotics, it means correct, straight upright, or it means correct. And yeah, in the way that upright does somewhat in English. Okay, so first I shall try to make the record correct, to point out the Eros who is to be praised, and then to praise him in a manner worthy of the god. We all know there is no Aphrodite without Eros. I don't know if we all know that. There is no Aphrodite without Eros. It does appear to be the other way around. Well, it could be, you could say it's the other way around. There's no Eros without, there's no Eros without Aphrodite. But then when you have Socrates' Eros, which appears to be an erotic desire purely, A, for the beings, and B, there's a dialogue called the Lysis, where he says, from a young age, I've had an erotic desire for philia, for friendship, which is an extremely weird thing to say. I have an erotic desire for friendship. But what that appears to be shorthand for is that my longing is directed towards the intelligible principles of things, which are completely shareable beings, so I can have a philia, a friendship, that is a genuine common good, because the more we share with each other of what we know, the greater is each of our goods, as opposed to wine or money or fame. Those things you can't share. And so you and your friend must take less if your friend is to have more. Yeah. So there might be Eros without Aphrodite, because Aphrodite means sex. In Homer, ta Aphrodisia, the things of Aphrodite, the golden deeds and words of Aphrodite, that refers to what we now in our pseudo-scientific language call sex. Okay, and were she, Aphrodite, one, Eros will be one. But since there are two Aphrodites, it is necessary that there be two, he says erotes, because that's in the Greek it's eros, erotos, and so two eroses. I'm just going to say eroses, because that sounds less weird in English. There'd be two eroses as well. Now, is that true? So you might have different forms of ta aphrodisia, different forms of sexual desire, but does that mean that there has to be a different kind of eros? But he says it is necessary that there be two eroses as well. I'm not quite sure that's necessary. He's big on necessity. There's a couple of times where he says this is necessary, and I don't know if it is. Who would deny that there are two goddesses? One surely is the elder and has no mother. That's going to be important because Pausanias has some very pro-patriarchal, anti-women things to say, because he's trying to endorse his particular kind of relationship. And if you're concerned, that will all be corrected later. So all the pro-patriarchal things will be criticize. In fact, our wisest speaker has to be introduced as a woman because there are no women at the symposium. But Socrates introduces her and says, everything I know I learned from a woman called Diotima. So the wisest person, apparently, in the whole dialogue is a woman. And that's a deliberate contradiction of this earlier emphasis upon masculinity. And it's already contradicted by the people who are giving this speech. Phaedrus, who is this young aesthete, who probably can't even lift a spear. I mean, he's endorsing war as the highest activity of human nobility. And Pausanias, he wants to endorse a kind of love affair that's not truly, strictly speaking, respectable. And he wants there to be a law to endorse it because he's so timid. And yeah, anyway. So those are the people endorsing masculinity, which is that's intentionally amusing on Plato's part. Anyway, so he's saying there are two eroses. One shorty is the elder and has no mother, but is the daughter of Uranos, the one to whom we apply the name Uranian. And the other is younger and the daughter of Zeus and Dione, the one we call Pandemus. So Uranian means, Uranos is another word for the heavens, but also a figure in Hesiod's Theogony who is in this train down to Zeus. But this is pre-Zeus, before Zeus has castrated his father and so on. So this is what we call, before the Olympian gods, the pre-Olympian gods. And then there's the Olympian gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, and so on. Now, and he is calling the younger Aphrodite Pandemus, which means it involves all of the people, as we all know from our recent studies of epidemiology. Epidemic means it is on the people. It's on the people. Pandemic is when it's on all of the people. You can't actually have a pandemic of a respiratory virus, but for a while we acted as if we could. So it is necessary that the Eros, who is a fellow worker with one, correctly be called Pandemus, and the other Uranian. Okay, so we have a Pandemian Aphrodite and a Pandemian Eros, a Uranian Aphrodite and a Uranian Eros. So it's necessary, yeah, okay. Now all gods must be praised, but one must try to say what has been allotted to each god. Now he's going to somewhat contradict that because he's going to strongly criticize the Pandemian Eros and praise the Uranian Eros. This is his motif. Now then he makes the following telling statement. Every action is of the following sort. When being done in terms of itself, it is neither noble or base. So no action in itself is noble or base. For example, what we are now doing, either drinking, singing, or conversing, none of these things is in itself a noble thing, only in terms of how it is done. In the doing of it, does it turn out to be the sort of thing that it is. For if it is done nobly and correctly, according to the standard that we are going to try to establish, it proves to be noble. And if incorrectly, base. So too in the case of loving and eros. Now, those are almost the same words. So he's got the infinitive, eran, to be in love. So too in the case of eran and eros, the god, almost the same word. Now, that's what is being indicated by that, is that he identifies the god, eros. This is the end of the god. From now on, it's the passion or the activity of loving that is his only concern. So he's taking care of a problem that Phaedrus has. So Phaedrus introduces his speech by saying Eros is the first of the gods and therefore the greatest. And he quotes three people, Hesiod, Parmenides, and someone called Arcesilaus. And he does that deliberately in that order. The text is been modified by modern editors, but that's the original order of the manuscripts. So Hesiod, Parmenides, and Acusilaus, just in order to say that the first thing that came to be was chaos, and then eros, and he skips out that. He skips the line that talk about the gods that appear between those. So because he doesn't believe in the gods. We know this from the dialogue of Phaedrus, where he dismisses myths and gods and whatnot. But then he mentions Parmenides, and Parmenides says that Genesis first of all devised eros, first among the gods. Now, the thing that Parmenides is known for is saying that only being is. Non-being is not, and so forth. And then in the third part of his poem, he says, he talks about the genesis of things and the phenomena that we experience. But that appears to be in tension with the first part of his poem, which is what he's famous for. And Phaedrus skips that too. For him, there's just genesis. There's just matter in motion. Now, why did I bring that up? Where are we?
So Pausanias is solving a problem.
Yes. So Phaedrus starts with this atheistic interpretation of the tradition. He uses the myth to reinforce his particular kind of eros, but then he has to bring the gods back in, because if the main way in which people display the nobility of eros is dying for their beloved. But if they're dying for the beloved, he now needs the gods to reward them after they've died. That's the first thing. And then the second thing he says, if a beloved dies for their lover, that's even more incredible. And the gods reward that even more because they're not inspired by any eros. This is him talking of himself. If I were to be so mad as to die for Eryximachus here, I would require a special reward because I'm not motivated towards him in the same way he's motivated towards me. So Phaedrus has this problem that he needs the gods that he has, but he doesn't believe in them. Right? Now, Pausanias is going to get rid of the gods. Eros is just the human passion, and we're going to deal with it on the level of human law. We don't need the gods. Okay. Yes.
I understand this and how is it that their actions don't have a passport and find to their needs man is effectively dying for his lover? That might be made because I think it's really being by being, but in fact, what it's doing is dying. Doesn't that make him the lover?
Well, when Phaedrus,
Martin, sorry,
yes.
Martin, we couldn't hear that. So could you just repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, if the beloved who does not feel the same eros for the lover dies for that lover, then doesn't make them in some way a lover because they've shown it in that. The thing is, he uses these expressions, the friendship, the philia. Philia is a very broad, it can also mean your family relations or your closest friends and so on, but just relations of intimacy and affection, but not eros, right? So the eros that comes from, the philia, the friendship, concerned with eros. So in both cases, like the Alcestis who dies for her husband, he describes her as being superior to his parents in philia, in friendship, because of her eros. And so it's the same with the beloved. They would be superior in the philia, in the friendship they're showing to the lover, without necessarily feeling the eros that, Now, but this is another thing that Plato is trying to say in every aspect of the phenomena, even the ones that he thinks are not noble, they reflect what is noble. And in the first speech, the two things that are put together most is love and death. In the obvious and straightforward sense of people dying for their love, the person that they love. Now, that's not the why that's not the real heart of that. There's the association between love and death, which is in a lot of literature. When the first time that Juliet speaks to Romeo is, he comes to her balcony, and she looks down, and as they talk, she says, "I can see you, but as if I'm seeing you." I don't remember the words, like inside an open coffin or something. Why is her first thought as she's falling in love of death? Now that's Phaedrus unknowingly links those two, and Socrates will try and develop that as somewhere near the core of Eros is an awareness of our own mortality. And you experience Eros when you're young and at other ages, but from the very, that's why your very first awareness of your mortality and your love occur together, and that's going to be made much of later on. Okay, so he's made this insane statement that every action is neither noble or base. Murder, well, it depends how you murder, in the right manner. Aristotle discusses exactly this. He doesn't discuss this passage, but in the Ethics, where he's talking about why a virtuous action is that between two means. And he says, but there are, of course, some actions that have no mean. For example, if you commit adultery, if you do it at the right time, wearing the right clothing, it doesn't make it any better than if you do, than doing it in some other way. It's just a bad thing. Same with murder and so on. So Pausanias has this problem, but that's because he's trying to say, if you do what I do, which many people would look at and say, that's, as Anna Joy was saying before, that doesn't look like a particularly equal relationship and so on. Isn't that someone taking advantage of someone? Yes, but he's trying to make it, beautify it in the same way that Socrates washed himself and put on new shoes. He is trying to beautify this activity that he indulges in. Okay. By saying if you do it in the right way, then it's beautiful. Okay, so I think I finished that paragraph, so right down the bottom of page 10, at the last paragraph. Now the Eros who belongs to Aphrodite, the Pandemian Aphrodite Pandemus, is truly Pandemian. Pandemian it couldn't just mean democratic. It applies to the whole people, but it also can have the sense of common. It's truly common and acts in any sort of way. And here you have the one whom good-for-nothing human beings have as their love. Those who are of the same sort as this Eros are, first of all, so he's going to say first, second, third. I think this translation will follow that. And he's going to point out three aspects of the wrong kind of Eros. And so when we reverse that, we'll get the principles of the right kind of Eros, as he'll then explicate. And then we'll see how that works out for his understanding of this relationship. So first of all, they are no less in love with women than with boys. Okay? I'm just reading the text. Secondly, they are in love with those people's bodies rather than their souls. So women is equally with men, bodies rather than souls. And thirdly, they are in love with the stupidest there can be. The word, it's the contrary of the word for nous, the one with the least mind possible, right? So stupid. For they have an eye only to the act. So the Pandemian, the people with this kind of Eros are only concerned about success, sexual success. They're not concerned about the soul, the mind, which Pausanias, associates with the male. Okay, they're concerned only with the act, and they're unconcerned with whether it's noble or not. That is how it happens that it turns out for them, however it turns out, with the same likelihood of its being good as the opposite. So it's, what do you say? The words imply that they act at random, and the result is random. Since every act can be either good or bad, it occasionally turns out good, occasionally bad. He can't say it's always bad, because no act is good or bad in itself. That would undermine his whole shtick, right? He's got to say it's how it's done. Okay. So for Eros, Pandemus, the Pandemian Eros, depends on the Aphrodite who is far younger than the other goddess and who partakes in her birth of female as well as of male. So the Pandemian Eros is born of Zeus and Dione, so partakes of the female. But the Uranian Eros, the Uranian Aphrodite is female, so he hasn't got rid of that. He says, but the other Eros is Uranian Aphrodite, who first of all does not partake of female, but only of male, which is odd because it's a female, it's Aphrodite. And he says, only partakes of male, and this is the love of boys. And secondly, is the elder and has no part in outrage. So outrage is this Greek word that we sometimes use in English, hubris, and which which as an official crime is the crime of sexual assault and other crimes. But it's that kind of arrogance or violence. Now he's trying to say that there's a kind of eros of a younger male that is not hubristic. That's his point. That is how it comes about that those inspired by this kind of love turn to the male with an affection for that which is naturally more vigorous, stronger. It's just stronger and has more mind. Here it's got has more vigorous and has more sense. Perfectly fine as a translation, but it's just helpful to know that he's saying stronger and more intelligent. And one might recognize he says, he actually translates this as pederasty. Now, paiderastia is this incongruent relationship of an older and a younger man. Our example in the symposium, we have two examples in the symposium. Pausanias, who is presumably 50-something, and Agathon, who's 30-something. Eryximachus, who's 40-something, and Phaedrus, who's probably 30-something. So that's not what we associate with the crime of pederasty, right? It's this incongruous relationship in age, and they met when presumably Agathon and Pausanias met when Agathon was late teens. But it's not, it's just to point out that the way we use the word is just straightforwardly for the crime, not this other kind of relationship. In any case. Okay. Now he says, for they do not love boys except when boys start having sense, that is a mind, an intellect, a nous, and that is close to the time when the beard first appears, which I think is now lower in it. I think, aren't we all hitting puberty much faster than... Yeah, the chicken that we're eating with steroids. For those who start loving a boy at this point in time are in a position, I believe, to be with him, which is a very broad word, being with any kind of intercourse, social, sexual, be with him and live with him for their whole life. Which describes Pausanias and Agathon. Right? They've been together for 15 years and presumably stay together. In fact, according to the records, they do stay together when Agathon leaves and he goes to a tyrant in Macedon in 406. Okay, so that's one kind of, this is what he's trying to preserve. This is good. And he says, and not, once they have deceived and seized, that he's been successful with, a young and foolish boy, to laugh at him and then run off to another. So he's trying to differentiate himself from that kind of lover of a youth. I'll read on this briefly and then we'll have a break. Now, if you look at that situation, there are these people who take advantage of younger people. They have some kind of sexual intercourse with them and then run off and deceive them, right? And then there's people like him who stay together for their whole lives and do things in a noble manner. And now the next phrase is, there should have been a law. So what law should there be? Well, maybe a law to protect the young people or something. That's not what he does. It's very amusing, unintentionally. There should have been a law as well to prohibit the loving of boys. Yes, to protect them, yes? in order that a lot of zeal would not have been wasted for an uncertain result. For it's not clear where the perfection of boys has its end with regard to the virtue and vice of both soul and body. So no, we shouldn't have a law to protect young people. We should have a law to prohibit lovers from wasting their time on those who are young, because you don't know how they'll turn out. And you could buy them lots of gifts and take them to dinner, and then you could waste that money. So we're trying to restrict you. Be sensible. Like he's talking very much from his own point of view, as everyone does in the symposium. Okay, we should stop because it's already 5:10. So, and you've shown considerable philosophical endurance. So, if we come back in 10 minutes from now, thanks. Okay. Very good. Right, back to our text. And okay, so at 181E, he says, now the good people willingly lay down this law upon themselves. They willingly, which remind, self-legislation, a bit different from Kant's self-legislation. But there should have been applied the same sort of compulsory prohibition to those pandemian lovers, just as we compel them as far as we can not to love free-born women. This translation is matrons, but free-born women. For here you have those who have made paiderastia a disgrace, so that some have the nerve to say that it's shameful to gratify lovers. So this is his whole concern, is that people say it's shameful for an agathon, a young, attractive agathon, to gratify him, the older lover. He wants to overturn that. That's his problem, his personal problem, which he invokes this whole discussion of approaching philosophy and political freedom through that lens. Okay, so he says, they say it's shameful with an eye to those pandemian lovers observing their impropriety. It's lack of timing, because they're with someone who's young, and injustice, since surely any action whatsoever that is done in an orderly and lawful way would not justly bring about reproach. So that's his thesis. There's no act that is bad in itself. It just depends on the context, right? Which is also and that's the problem. Now he's saying that the people who he's saying are the pandemian ones here are the ones who love someone who's too young, and then deceive them and desert them or whatever. And he's trying to distinguish his act from that. So now we have a discussion of the law. And law, so the Greek word law, nomos, means, from which we get nominal, right? It's something positive, but it doesn't mean traffic regulations. It means the principles that a society inculcates. So it means custom as well as written and unwritten law. Now, in modern societies, it's difficult to understand that easily because we obviously have customs, but we increasingly try to diminish the area in which customs operate, because you're now free to do what you want. There's the legal restraints, and then you have a certain degree of freedom. Because it turns out, if you say to everyone you're free, that you then have to police everything, because you want people's freedom can't impinge on other people's freedom. And so now you're policing everything. Right? But the original idea is that there is a certain area that's legislated, you can't do this, and everything else is the realm of freedom. Right? And that's not the understanding of law in antiquity or medieval period. The law is the written and unwritten principles or customs. Okay, so he says, now in general, the law about love in other cities is easy to understand. And he said before that in Athens, it's difficult to understand. And he's going to clarify this for us. For it has been simply determined, but the law here and in Sparta is complicated. So he makes this distinction, which I'll read this and then put it on the board just to help frame our discussion. In Elis and among the Boeotians, and where they are not wise in speaking, the gratification of lovers has been unqualifiedly legalized as noble, and no one, whether young or old, would say that it's shameful. So in these slightly more licentious Greek cities, so Greek, where they just say it's noble to gratify a lover under any circumstances. He says, this is so, I suspect, in order that they might have no trouble in trying to persuade the young by speech, because they are incapable of speaking. So they're not educated, and therefore they don't want to make trouble for themselves by having to seduce people. So they deem it to be noble. In Ionia, on the other hand, and in many other places, wherever they live under the barbarians. So Ionia is now the coast of what we would call Turkey, which was then Persia. And the Ionian cities were the Greek cities on the west part of the Persian Empire, which were often under the rule of the Persians, the barbarians. Right. Wherever they live under the barbarians, it is customarily held to be shameful in the eyes of barbarians on account of their tyrannies. Paiderastia, as well as philosophy and the love of gymnastics, is shameful. For I suspect that it is not to the advantage of the rulers that great and proud thoughts should be engendered among the subjects any more than strong friendships and associations. So he is saying that there are certain activities, this kind of love affair, gymnastics, which, athletic training together, and philosophy produce friendship. And those friendships lead to what he says, great and proud thoughts. That phrase recurs in Aristophanes' speech. We need to take note of that because it becomes important. But pride is induced from friendship because you have an association with people on an equal footing, like you're training together or you're philosophizing together. And he says the friendship that comes from this, that leads to pride, and therefore it's banned where the barbarians rule, because they want humble citizens. Humble subjects, not citizens, because citizens have a role in ruling, subjects don't. They don't need to be wise in speech, they just rule. Yeah. It is precisely this that eros, that is proud friendship that leads to pride, it's precisely this that eros, as well as all those other things, especially tends to implant, as well as gymnastics and philosophy. And the tyrants here in Athens actually learned this by deed, for the love of Aristogaton and the friendship of Harmodius. So that imbalanced relationship, Aristogaton's the older man, Harmodius has the friendly relationship with him. Once it became firm, dissolved the tyrant rule. There's a number of controversies about this, but the Athenians did have a statue of Aristogaton and Harmodius for killing Pisistratus. Now, there's a footnote by Benedetti. He says, it did not, however, end the tyranny, but made it harsher. Yeah, and Thucydides says they didn't do it to end the tyranny. They did it because this guy's sister was not given the role of leading one of the festivals or something. So anyway, but it is an Athenian myth that this couple murdered this tyrant. So wherever it has been laid down as shameful to gratify lovers, it has been through the vice of those who have done so, the hankering, the desire after more on the part of the rulers, and the lack of manliness, which is a translation of a word that can mean courage, Andrea, right? Which literally means manliness, but it's normally courage. The lack of courage on the part of the subjects. So that requires two things. So under the barbarians, because of the lack of courage of the subjects, and because of the greed of the rulers, they make it always bad to gratify a lover. And wherever the gratifying of lovers has been held to be a noble thing without qualification, it has been through the slothfulness of soul of those who have so ordained. Okay, so I'm just going to put this on the board just because it will become... He has this paradox. So we have some Greek city. It's simple. It's always known. for a beloved to gratify. And then we have Greek cities under the barbarian. And it's always base, shameful. And that's because these guys can't speak. Cannot speak, articulately argue. And that's because of the reading rules. And subjects. Now, then we get to, he says at first, Sparta and Athens. Sparta is dropped in most of the modern editions. They'll take out the word Sparta because he never mentions it again. And the reason has to be something to do with the fact that the Spartans are famously not eloquent. So he's going to make the principle that he wants to establish for his own kind of the kind of love affair he wants to promote is that it promotes intelligence. It depends on intelligence and it promotes excellence in philosophy and speech. That doesn't work for Sparta, so he just drops it. So now he's going to say Athens has a divergent, complicated law, and he will present a resolution. So what he's really trying to do is change the ethos, change the law in order to endorse his activity. Okay, so we're now at 182D. Here in Athens, there are much nobler customs than elsewhere, yet just as I said, they are not easy to understand. Let one just reflect that it is said to be a nobler thing to love openly than in secret, and particularly to love the noblest and the best. Now, the best there is the people who are well born, even if they are uglier than others. Right? So Pausanias is attached to convention and law. He wants a change in the law to endorse his kind of relationship, but he endorses what is noblest with what is conventionally noble. And again, that everyone enthusiastically encourages the lover and not as if he were doing anything shameful. And if a lover makes a successful capture, it's a more technical way of putting it, but it is thought to be noble, and if he fails, shameful. And that for making an attempt at seizure, the law grants the lover the opportunity to be praised for doing amazing deeds. If one dared do any of these deeds in pursuing and wishing to accomplish anything else whatever, except this, one would reap the greatest rewards leveled against philosophy. Reproaches. Now, what's the greatest reproach leveled against philosophy? In the Apology of Socrates, in the defense speech, which is the only dialogue that has Socrates in the name, he has to defend himself against the charge that he doesn't believe in the gods of the city. Right? Now, lovers reap the greatest reproaches leveled against philosophy because they swear all kind of oaths by the gods. By the gods, I will love you forever. And then they break those oaths, so they can't believe in the gods. Now, because people haven't been able to figure that out, they just take that out of the text. It doesn't make sense to me, so therefore I won't try and figure it out. I will just take it out of the text. But it's in the text. It's in the entire manuscript tradition, just in case you're looking at a translation that doesn't have it. Okay, now what he said is, he has said that the law in Athens, the custom in Athens, is that lovers are always encouraged, and he's going to depend on that. Because he's going to come to a law that seems to prohibit his kind of love. He's just going to say, we can finesse these. Now, he says, for if in wanting to take money from someone or to take a government office or any other position of power, so money or power, one were willing to act just as lovers do towards their beloved, that is, making all sorts of supplications and beseechings in their requests, that is, begging, right? Swearing oaths, sleeping at the doors of their beloveds, and being willing to perform acts of slavishness that not one slave would, he would be checked from doing so by his enemies as much as by his friends, the former reproaching him for his flatteries and civilities, the latter admonishing him and feeling ashamed on his behalf. But if the lover does all of this, there is a grace upon him, and the law allows him to act without reproaching him on the ground that he is attempting to carry through some exceedingly noble thing. And what is most dreadful, as the many say, is that if he swears an oath and then departs from his oath, for him alone there is pardon from the gods, for they deny that an oath in sex is an oath. Okay, so that's the main thing. You swear by the gods, I will always love you, I will never blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, abandon that oath 6 months or however long the period may be down the track. And that, if you do that, that implies you don't believe in the gods that endorse the oath. That's why it would be the greatest reproach against philosophy. So he is saying that there is it's not a regulation, but it's in the Athenian custom to praise lovers even when they act in that way, which would otherwise be a base. Okay. So at 183c, thus the gods and human beings have made every opportunity available to the lover as the law here states. Now, on these grounds, one might suppose that it's customarily held, that it's lawful to be a very noble thing in this city, both to love and for lovers to have friends. But on the other hand, so that's the one Athenian custom. On the other hand, when fathers set attendants, the word pedagogue literally means to guide a pice, to guide a youth, to guide a boy. And it's the person who takes the boy to school from home so that none of these people pester him. And that's what pedagogue means. Well, that's what it means. That's where it's derived. And the attendants, but on the other hand, when fathers set attendants, pedagogues, in charge of the beloveds and prohibit them from conversing with their lovers, and the intendant has this as a standing order to stop lovers from talking to the young people. And the beloved's contemporaries and comrades blame him if they see anything like this going on. And the elders in turn do not stand in the way of those who cast reproaches or abuse them on the grounds that they are speaking incorrectly, because from his point of view, from Pausanias' point, it's incorrect to abuse lovers. Right? Then if one glances in this direction, one will believe that such a thing is customarily held to be most shameful. So we have an apparent contradiction in Athenian custom. It's noble to pursue a youth. Right? The youth is told it's ignoble, it's shameful to talk to the lover. Okay? Now, it's very easy for us to understand this in terms of, I don't know if this is around anymore, but there used to be this double standard that boys would want to be seen to be very successful with girls, but girls were admonished to be modest. Yes, and so I have heard the expression double standard applied to this phenomenon. That's kind of what he's reproducing, that we have these two customs that appear to be in tension with one another. So he's going to sort this out. This is to be explained, I believe, as follows. The matter is not simple, and as was said at the start, it is neither noble nor base in itself. Now, what is he talking about when he means what is noble or base? He's talking about these two people getting together, right? The youth and the older man. And it's not noble or base in itself, but if nobly done, noble, and if basely done, base. Okay. Now, it is base to gratify one who is no good and to do so in a bad way. So it's base to gratify, so the same act, It's base if the person that you're doing it with is base, while it's noble to gratify the good person and to do so in a noble way. Okay, he is the Pandemian lover who is no good, the one in love with the body rather than the soul. He is not even, for example, a lasting lover because he is in love with the thing that is not lasting either. As soon as the bloom of the body fades, which is what he was in love with, he is off and takes wing, having made a foul shame of many speeches and promises. But he who is in love with a good character remains throughout life, like Pausanias with Agathon. For he is welded, he is fused with that which is lasting, which is with the good character. So does this make sense so far as a defense? Why are you nodding?
Custom.
Sorry? Custom. Just this is the nomos. Yeah, because it's kind of odd because he's saying, okay, we have the same act. It's base if the people there are base, and it's noble if they are people of good character. Whereas someone who considered this act not to be good, it wouldn't really matter, particularly what they were like in other aspects of their life. But he's saying if you do it, it's the same act. If it's done for the right, in the light of what is lasting, and that's character. Now, okay, so let's say we have the young person does admire the older person for their character. Is this the best way to express that admiration? I think it's kind of unintentionally funny. But
We've got a kind of a ringing example of this in just the different ways that we understand marriage. Like marriage, it is the endorsed version of two people being together, and it's okay when it's in church and it's fine. I mean, it was 80 years ago, but not okay when that ceremonious part of it never took place. That's what he's talking about.
yeah, that's a helpful parallel, because in each case it's the custom, the law, that endorses one and not the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected. Okay, so
could it also be that and this is a different person who's talking about this, but that there's a kind of generative act. There's something creative about Eros, and that's why it was there sort of in between chaos and earth and creating something. And so if you're going to create something, it might as well be good and edifying. You might as well be doing it with somebody who is actually has good characteristics. And so whatever the progeny of that, whether it's actual children or it's a creative act of writing or producing something, then it's better if you're doing it with someone for the right reasons and for a creative act that's going to benefit both of you. Maybe. Like, I think maybe that's part of what he's saying, is that there's no good or bad act. So you can't really, but Eros necessarily has a creative element of it in it. Just say no.
yes, no, this is helpful. That's two helpful remarks, which we'll keep in mind, whether or not he can, because, but what I think we might be doing though is we're looking aside, which I want to keep doing. I want to keep looking aside from the actual act. But if you think about what he's actually saying, it'll become clearer soon too. But what is interesting though is, okay, so yes, he is saying that, that they have a mutual project of making something, which is the character of the young person.
Yes.
They're going to improve that. And this, therefore, is good because it's part of that project.
Yeah, and that's also kind of creepy at the same time, you know. And
Yes, I think that that's the unintentional part of what Pausanias is saying, that it's kind of creepy because he's got a motive that can't speak his name in his speech. Because it's not really going to help the character of the young person to be gratifying him.
no,
No, but
no.
that's what he's trying to argue for.
Yeah, well, I would give his speech a 3 out of 10 for that.
Yeah.
About the young person, you know, so to say, only able to engage with them. That's what is wrong about whether it's
That's exactly what it looks like, because he says that about being together forever and here being attached to what is lasting. But keep that in mind, because that also gets a qualification.
Martin, could you repeat that question, please?
Yes. Yeah, so Duncan is saying that what appears to be admired is the lasting relationship. And that if it leads to the lasting relationship, then that's good. That's going to be qualified shortly too. But here he's saying, yeah, but he who is in love with a good character remains throughout life because he's welded to what is lasting. That reappears in Socrates' speech as if there is a genuine human eros for what is genuinely always, then it would be for what Socrates sometimes calls the forms, the principles of things, which are unchanging, not strictly, directly for a human being. And he discusses in one passage, well, he has Diotima describe this progression of eros from finding one person beautiful and then realizing, well, there are actually several people who share this same characteristic of beauty. And that's ascending towards beauty itself, which is always. And these people who possess some beauty change. Okay, so aspects of all of these other reflections of what eros is come back in. Now, he's going to say, he's going to try and bring together these two Athenian laws. I want to skip ahead a bit to read something he says shortly. And he says, first of all, it's base, or it's seen to be shameful if the young person allows themselves to be caught too soon. And then secondly, he says to be caught by power and political money is shameful. And that's a part of what Socrates is teaching too, that there are ends or fulfillments that money and political power can't realize. Okay, but here, this is Pausanias saying, for neither money nor political powers are thought to be stable or lasting, to say nothing of the fact that in the natural course of things, no noble or generous friendship comes out of them. So that was what I mentioned before about the possibility of having a genuine common good in a friendship. If your dealings together are only about money, then you don't have a genuine common good. You have a temporary common good, as long as you're both making money. So there's only one, so this is what he says. So there's only one way left according to our law. If a beloved is to gratify a lover in a noble way, for just as we have a law that in the case of lovers, to be enslaved willingly in any slavery to the beloved is agreed not to be flattery, nor a matter of reproach, so too there is only one other willing enslavement that is not a matter of reproach. This is the enslavement regarding virtue. So his difficulty is that he is trying to say there are two principles that make this activity noble. One, the presence of intellect or education or virtue, and freedom. But both of those contain great difficulties, because if the principle was intellect, then you would have Alcibiades being the lover of Socrates, because Socrates is far wiser than any 17-year-old. If the principle is freedom, that tends to lead immediately, well, not immediately, but the freedom leads to Elis and Belutia, where it's just you can do whatever you like, license. Right? What is the principle of the semi-restraint that endorses his particular kind of love? And he's trying to say if you combine these laws, it turns into a test. The beloved has to hold out for a certain amount of time. And if the lover, and that proves their character, right? And the lover is tested by having to wait. Okay? And this is at 184D. For whenever lover and beloved come to the same point, each with a law, so these two separate customs, the one, in serving a beloved who has granted his favours, would justly serve in anything. The act doesn't matter, it's how it's done. And the other, in assisting him who is making him wise and good, would justly assist. So we've got one person making wise and good this other person, and the other person wanting to become wise and good. And the one is able to contribute to prudence and the rest of virtue, while the other stands in need of them for the acquisition of education and the rest of wisdom. Then and only then, when the laws converge, does it result that a beloved's gratification of his lover is noble, but in any other circumstance it's not. Now, so that he's tried to finesse these two laws and say, my relationship is endorsed by this, but there's no restriction on the lover. All they have to do is be resisted. They're not being told to modify their behavior or conduct SAT tests on potential lovers or anything. They're not restrained at all. It's all the effort is on the lover, on the beloved, to fend them off for an appropriate period of time, right? And that makes the deed noble. Now, there's a qualification of all of this that I think reveals the underlying problem very well. Just before 185A, he says, even to be deceived in this regard is no disgrace. So even if the beloved is wrong that the lover is a decent person with good character who can teach them to be excellent, even if they're completely wrong, that doesn't matter. But in all other cases, whether one is deceived or not, it does involve disgrace. So if someone granted his favors to a lover for the sake of wealth because he thought him rich and then were deceived and got no money when the lover was found to be poor, it is no less a disgrace. For a beloved of that sort is thought to display his very self as one who for the sake of money would serve anyone and anything, and this is not noble. So along the same line of argument, were someone to grant his favors because he thought that his lover was good and that he himself would be better through his friendship with his lover, then even if this lover is found to be bad and without virtue, the deception is noble all the same. So even if the beloved is completely wrong about the lover, then it's still everything, it is noble for that person to gratify the lover.
But it's the deception that's noble?
No, the act that we're not naming, because that would kind of disturb this tenuous web of rhetoric that we're weaving around this act. The assumption is that the deception would be found out if the beloved thinks that someone is noble and good and will help them become so, and then somehow, after the sexual relationship has become, they find out this person isn't as noble and good as they thought. Then they stop and they run. That person, the lover, runs away. But then he too is thought to have made playing what holds in his own case, this beloved, that strictly for the sake of virtue and becoming better, he would show his total zeal in everything. And this is the noblest thing of all. I just find that quite amusing. This is the most noble thing that can happen. Isn't that funny? I mean, perhaps if I could put some photos, I could put some illustrations up and say, this is the most noble thing of all. I think it's quite fun. Yeah. I think he's yeah. There's a deep tension between what he wants, which he's the physical attraction that he wants to endorse, and the justification that it makes people more excellent in their character. It's not necessarily, the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive at all. In fact, I mean, our notion of how things should work out is that these things precisely go together. You admire and are attracted to your beloved, and it's mutual. Like that's what we want, everything. So we want what is very difficult and rare. We want that to be the most common thing. But that's a worthy ideal, right? There's no need for them to be apart, but it's just. But for him, there's a real tension in what he's saying he wants and what he wants.
Is in a sense like capturing some of that erotic spirit, like that's what we want to do, the most powerful force in the universe. Like if we can capture it in this method, even though there is deception involved, like we want that noble erotic spirit to exist.
Well, but this is the difficulty here, though. Okay, so the eros here is only the eros for the person, right? So the desire, so he's saying, okay, the beloved thinks, where is it? Yeah, he thinks that the lover will make them better, and they show zeal in becoming better, but it's not quite the same as having an eros for becoming better. Right? The eros is the erotic desire that one person feels and the other doesn't. They're going to have at best friendship, gratitude to the other person. But I mean, yeah, eros as a whole is reconstituted totally with the next four speakers. So it's not this narrow understanding where there's a tension between the erotic desire and the admiration for virtue. And it's almost laughably in tension at this point, where they can be deceived, and that's still an exhibition of their noble character. It's actually 6 o'clock. So Pausanias' speech is the second longest after Socrates'. And because it combines this discussion of the Greek notion of freedom and therefore citizenship and therefore friendship, and these are things that had a real force and allowed them to defeat the Persians and allowed them to provide the only model we have of citizenship, which has then had this enormous influence, and is, the modern societies. But it comes in this oblique way as a justification for a particular kind of relationship.